Well, welcome back to another episode of the Empower Grief Journey podcast. I'm your host, Chris Mamone, and I'm an acceptance coach who helps people heal from grief, loss, and trauma to discover their self acceptance and step into their personal power. This podcast is your dedicated space for healing, growth, and transformation. Each episode shares insightful and inspirational stories, along with practical tools and actionable insights that can help guide you along your healing journey. Today, I have an awesome guest with us. Her name is Jillene Gallatin. She's out of Minnesota and she is a chaplain and a priest. And long story short, we had a very powerful conversation about God and grief, and I'm excited for her to share her story with us. A little bit of background about Jillene. In 1988, at just 14 years old, she experienced the sudden and profound loss of her mother. At that time, resources to support young people navigating grief were scarce, especially for teenagers. This life-altering moment shaped her calling, which was to create compassionate spaces and advocate for importance of grief support and mental wellness. Jillene is an ordained pastor at the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America since 2001. Her commitment to walking alongside others in their healing journey has only deepened over the years. She's now a certified 300-hour yoga teacher with a specialization in grief yoga, as well as a cultivating connection in communities and offering holistic tools for those navigating the complex terrain of loss. And when she's not supporting others, she finds grounding in nature, spending outdoor time with her husband Peter, their dog Gus, and their adult children. So without further ado, Jillene, I want to welcome you onto the podcast.
Hi, Chris. Thank you so very much. Yeah, great to be with you here today.
Yeah, I'm really excited because we had a very awesome, very deep and moving call when we first met a couple, I think it was probably 2, 3 weeks ago now. Time
Yeah.
has flown by. But you shared a very powerful story about the loss of your mother at such a young age, by the way. And I know that transition to a lot of things we'll jump into in this episode. But I want to start off by giving you some space to tell our listeners a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thank you. As you shared in my bio, I serve a congregation rooted in Christianity. We're in the ELCA. And so, what's always been really important for me is to create connection for people recognizing their higher power. For me, it's God, and how we recognize God's presence in our own lives and be able to share that and support each other in different ways, especially in grief and loss, which is unique, uh, I think, as a whole, but especially as how it's come up for me now in this season of life, so to speak.
Well, I think one of the really fascinating things that you shared in our first conversation, and I loved why you brought it up, is that you got into yoga pretty much on an undirected path. It just kind of happened, so to speak, through the congregation. And as we heard in your intro, it's now become something that you're passionate about and has also helped you through that grief space. Um, I,
Mhm.
I'd love for you to share that story really quickly because it's really fun.
Yeah. So I have been practicing yoga for 17 years now on my own. And then in the pandemic, I was curious about what it would be like to study yoga, as I was trying to navigate all the things as we all were. Uh, and by nature, I like to know how things work or how things come to be. So I began studying it. So then, fast forward, we ended up in this new community, and the congregation was looking for ways to support community needs. And one of the things that came up was that there was a lack of resources around mental wellness. And so some leaders of our congregation said, what would it be like if we brought in a yoga teacher? And at that point, they didn't know that I practiced yoga and they didn't know that I was almost done with my certification. So as they continued to talk about it, what would it would be like? What would it be like? I felt like I finally had to say, you guys, okay, I gotta tell you something. I'm almost done with my training. And so then we looked at what would it be like if I led yoga from within the church walls. And I'm so glad that we did that because there were some people who said, absolutely not. You know, yoga does not belong in the church. And I appreciated that one leader even said, yoga is connected with sex cults. And I was just really needing to take a pause with that and invite people to share more of that experience, and was able to share my own practice was that as you shared, my mom died when I was 14. Fast forward almost 40 years later, I was still trying to come to terms with it. And so yoga was a practice that helped me do it. So when I was on my mat, that's where I found healing and groundedness and forgiveness and love and compassion. So to have somebody in the congregation say, this is what it is, and me to say, this is what it is, and to just have those conversations together really allowed us to connect that compassion and that care and be able to have some of these bigger questions about what are our beliefs. And I think that that has helped to shape how we talk about grief now from our congregation and within the community. So that was a little tangent. Sorry, I'll step back to then we decided that I would offer yoga during the season of Lent for 5 weeks from our congregation. And we said, we'll start and end at this time. We won't charge anybody because I'm a new teacher. If it tanks, we tried it. And if it goes well, let's see what that might look like. So my first class that I ever taught ever as a yoga teacher, and the first time it had been offered at the church, we had 57 people.
57 people. Wow, that is a lot.
It is. So I was so grateful to my husband who happened to be at that class, and he could tell that I was just kind of getting overwhelmed. And he said, "It's just you and me. You've practiced this routine, countless times. Just pretend we're in our living room and you got this." And so at the end of that class, everybody quit. And so that felt like such a holy affirmation to say, what could this gift be like for other people? This practice that has been so pivotal in my own healing journey, what would it be like to offer that to other people? So I did the next 4 weeks and then offered yoga kind of intermittently at the church, a little more hit or miss. But then the following summer, your congregation really talked about what else could this look like as a ministry? Yoga as one piece, and could there be more? So
That's beautiful. And how many years have you been doing yoga at the congregation?
one,
Just 1 year.
just
Oh, I assume of 57 people, I was starting to think, they might just enjoy this thing more than you even anticipated, and that might be growing in numbers here in the following years.
yeah, that would be great. So now we do offer it every week, and I average about mm, 9 people, and that's a good size yoga class in our area. So that 57 was such an anomaly, but also just the community support to say Grace is trying new things. Grace Lutheran Church is trying new things. Um, and then, as that is continued on with the grief journey and what we offer, that ongoing curiosity and welcome and support has just been fantastic. I'm guessing we'll talk a little bit more about that too.
Well, I think that's what's unique about grief journeys is that they're very
Mhm.
personal journeys. I always
Yeah.
share in my podcast, there's no right way or wrong way to grieve. There's no 12-step process you're going to follow and it's going to work out for you. It's very
Right.
much about discovering as you have on your story. That's what I loved about your grief journey, by the way, when we talked is you navigated that a lot on your own, but you had little things happen along the way that helped you navigate it just a little bit easier. And so I wanted to give you some space to talk about, that passing with your mom that happened at such a young age. I know that was also a different time period from where we're at today, by the way, because it happened a long time ago. And I know that back in the day, resources for grief were very few and far between. I know when I talk to older generations that were from that time, grief is kind of something that's shoved under the carpet, not talked about. It's something that people say to move on and let go, and the world continues. That as we've come to find with grief in the modern day today, grief is actually something that when we do that, it becomes harmful in our life. So by learning how to give it acknowledgement and hold a space for it, so that we can navigate that fully, process our emotions, and be ultimately meet the new version of ourselves is really the new way of handling grief. And so I wanted to open up that chapter for you to talk about that a little bit and what your experience was like.
Yeah, I so appreciate what you just said in getting to know the new version of ourselves or something like that. I'm glad this is recorded. I'm going to have to go back and listen to this. But yeah, you're exactly right. When I was 14, it was the late 80s. And as you said, there were not many resources, even fewer for children and teens. And my mom's sudden death was by suicide. So there were even fewer resources. And I too was told, you know, this is hard for everybody. We're not going to talk about it, figure it out. And yet that that was not my story. I know that I'm a kinesthetic person. I move, I feel. That's a way that I connect with people is to hold space and recognize their struggle. And I think because I don't feel that I was given that opportunity to really grieve and process and say, one night my mom is under my roof and the next night she is gone. I'm not going to hear her voice or feel her touch anymore. That's just done. And I I'm struggling with, trying to move on with that. That's how I felt at age 14. But yet hearing everybody tell me, you just got to figure it out, got to figure it out. I stuffed it down for so long. Um, and then Yeah, fast forward. It's still so deep in my bones, Chris. I still just feel these and remember these things. So then moving forward, always being a curious, I'm having a big curiosity of what would it have been like if I was able to think and feel and talk and process these things instead of just stuffing it down. Because I think, well, the case for me was I could only hold it down for so long. And then in my late 40s, when I was kind of becoming I guess early 40s, when I was becoming the age that my mom was, I had a breakdown. And I was so afraid of that. But I appreciated that when I was blessed to partner with just a wise individual, I said, why is this happening? I'm stuffing down. I'm just going forward as best as I can. And they said, the tools that you used before to just keep shoving it down are no longer working. And so maybe you need to try learning some new tools. And it was such a gift, so much permission to just be like, what would serve me? Um, and that was a big piece of that yoga is that what I wondered about would serve me. And then I did find out did help in the healing was connecting with those feelings, the fear, the anger, the isolation, the rejection, the resentment. It was still all in my body. So that when it was coming up and I was trying to figure out what new tools could access that, what I found that as I accessed it, it didn't limit me. It allowed me to finally release it and live with more love and trust and compassion and forgiveness, right? It's just a complete, like you said, I love it, new version of myself that offers authenticity and space. A different message. When people are told, figure it out, get over it, onward. Yes, and.
I love that the way you said that. Yes, and um,
Mhm.
you brought up, forgiveness, authenticity, and space, and I think those are very big parts of the grief process that a lot of people overlook. And something that I've learned on my grief journey is we've got to forgive ourselves, big time. I always hear, I've been trying to change the way the world sees forgiveness in a lot of ways because we talk about forgiveness always towards other people all the time. And
Mhm.
something that came to me, and I'll share my story on another podcast, but I went through a really rough time when I lost my child of narcissistic abuse from certain family members. And I could still this day have a hard time using that phrase forgiveness for others. But what I started doing recently when I ran into another chaplain is they said, "Why don't you forgive yourself?" And I said, "Well, that's an interesting proposition." I said, "Tell me more." And they
Mm.
said, "Why don't you think about your contribution, your role in that situation, what you saw from an observer standpoint, what you experienced from an observer standpoint, and forgive yourself because you didn't know at the time what was really going on." And a lot of us go through a grief process where we're so fixated on what happened to us that we oftentimes don't see from an observation point what was actually happening. And so there's always this personal dynamic of taking things personal is a light way I can say that, but it's really a place of when we talk about forgiveness is telling yourself, this is my contribution to this situation. This is my part that I took in things. I did the best I could with the tools and knowledge I had at the time. And what transpired is okay because I can't change it. It's okay. It's what happened. But I can make a different choice now and I can forgive myself for not knowing better. And I can forgive myself for maybe not seeing an option or an opportunity that was there all along. But now that I know and I see it, I can forgive myself because I did the best I could. And so going forward, I can choose to do this healing path a little differently. And I think that's one of the most powerful places you can start in that grief process.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you so much for sharing that because that was a big part of my story. I was the one living with my mom at the time of her death. It was just the two of us. And I had so much guilt, so much blame. I had told myself so many stories. I should have, if only I had done something different, I should have known something. And so finally, to have another possible way to look at the story of Jillene, you were 14. You were an adolescent. You were a child. Your brain wasn't fully formed, like physically, like all the logical pieces. You truly did the best you could. And I don't feel that other people blamed me, but I did. I was so hard on myself. So to be able to look at myself with compassion and to invite other people to hear that too, maybe that have not heard that message, is just a gift to be able to have other people consider that because it's a different message than what they're hearing and maybe a different message than what they're telling themselves.
Well, you brought up a good point, being an adolescent at 14 years old and watching one of your parents commit suicide. That's a hard thing to deal with, let alone in life, but as a child, because I can remember back being a teenager now, and I can say confidently, I did not know 90% of what I do now. I didn't. And
Right.
so when you go through an experience like that, and I've talked to quite a few people now since I started this podcast that have gone through suicide, watched it, had a family member go through it. And one of the biggest things with suicide is that there's a lot of times we just don't know why it happened. And so,
Right.
to your point, we start going down guilt and blame and shame because we're going, if I only knew, if I only
Yeah.
saw this sign, if I had been there differently, if I had showed up differently, we take so much on in that situation. And it's because there's a big unknown out there and a big uncertainty that 9 times out of 10, we're just not going to have an answer for. It's not going to happen. And that's a really hard reality to face, let alone process and deal with or understand. And I think to your point, being able to be kind to yourself with compassion and just say, like we've been talking about the last few minutes of, I did the best I could with the knowledge and skills I had in that moment. I did the best I could do. And
Right.
this is not the situation I wanted. This is not the one I asked for. I didn't even know how to deal with it at all. But, I can't sit there all the time and blame myself and guilt trip myself, because then I'm taking on an experience that wasn't even mine. And at that point too, when we do live in those emotions of guilt and shame, a lot of times we really collapse in on ourselves and we don't even give ourselves the opportunity to heal. That's the crazy part. We don't
Right.
allow ourselves to actually heal ourselves. And that can have very damaging consequences in our life in a lot of different ways. I've talked to people that have become alcoholics, gotten into drugs, or gotten into domestic violence, for example, all because that grief was never given space to be processed. That grief wasn't allowed to just be observed and be understood as best it could be. And I think that's something that we all struggle with when we go through grief. But to your point, recognizing that we need to hold space for grief is one of the
Yeah.
biggest steps we can take.
Yeah. Grief and pain needs to be witnessed. I was thinking, this is a little story. One time I was at the gym and was on a treadmill, and a couple machines down, an individual's phone rang. And usually gym etiquette is, you don't answer the phone, but it was such a situation where they answered and said hello. And they said, "Oh my gosh, you're kidding. That's great. Congratulations. Thank you for calling me." Person gets off the phone and they announce to anybody who will listen, "I'm going to be a grandparent. My child just called and said I'm going to be a grandparent." And everybody else was like, Great. That's so great." And I instantly thought of, we welcome that news. We celebrate that news. But I remember another time I was at the gym, and uh, the way that the gym was set up is we all were kind of very close to each other. And this person that I knew, because you kind of work out at the same time and you get to know of the people, the person came and said, "I just received word today that my son died." And everybody just like ignored what was said and just kept working out. Like, did I hear that right? Why did they say that? What are they doing? And they even said it a little bit later. And I remember somebody else, not even me, right? Because I wasn't in that space where I could hold space for other people, but said, "Did you say your child died today?" And the person said, "Yes." And we didn't say much more, but to be acknowledged, that's all that that person needed. And yet I've held those two stories together. We welcome and celebrate good news, right? A child is going to be born and welcomed into this world. Very different from my child. I just received word that my child died. Silence, right? Why don't we receive the same news, or, the news with the same response of, "I hear you. I weep with you," or "I celebrate with you." "I'm here for you." That's big news. We don't. We don't do that.
Yeah, that's
Pain and grief needs to be witnessed just as much as the joy.
I'm really glad you brought that story to the light, because that's exactly how we treat grief is when somebody
Mhm.
says, "Oh, I lost a parent," or "I lost a child," or everybody goes, "I don't know how to deal with this. This is
Right?
really uncomfortable for me."
Yeah.
And that's a thing too that I share a lot in my coaching, is that your grief will make other people uncomfortable, because
Mhm.
unfortunately people can only empathize to the level of their experiences in life. And so if they haven't lost a
Yes.
parent or they haven't lost a child, they don't know what to say and they don't know what to do. But to your point that I'm glad you brought up is grief just needs acknowledgement. And
Yeah.
you don't have to outpour, weird, awkward things onto somebody going through that. The best thing you can do is acknowledge and say, "I'm very sorry to hear that. or how can I support you today through this? And just
Right.
giving that griever some space and giving that griever the ability to communicate their needs at that point. And I think that's something we're just not taught how to do.
Right. We hear a baby's being born. Congratulations. Right? That's all that needs to be said. We hear somebody dies. We need to acknowledge that too. And we need to be comfortable with that as best we can. Yeah.
Yeah. My son was born, he was stillborn, and it was a
Yeah.
very, very tense, very emotional time. And I'm so grateful for this one nurse, just sharing off of the story you shared. I'm so grateful for this little nurse, Jessica. She wasn't more than
Yeah.
5'1", and this was during COVID, so she had like a mask, so I couldn't really see her face. But in the middle of this tense, quiet time, right after he was born, she goes, I'm really sorry to do this in this moment right now, but your son has the cutest freaking nose. And her just acknowledgement, like you were just talking about, that acknowledgement
Yes.
broke the tension in the room. And there was probably about 6 or 7 nurses in there with the doctor when we went through that whole thing. And all of a sudden, everybody started celebrating my little boy's life. And
Yes.
to your point, when you give that acknowledgement, and Jessica was the one that took the reins and, and stepped up and made it happen, it turned what was a very somber, very sad moment into something beautiful to celebrate. And
Yes.
I don't mean that as you're just gonna get on and move on with life, because that's definitely not what happens. But it's that acknowledgement, that space to take a I call it a brutal moment. It's a beautiful and a brutal moment mixed together. Um, into something that we can actually talk about and actually celebrate. And so I appreciate people that can do that. And I think to Jillene's point, that acknowledgement piece is big. And it's just something as little as, I'm really sorry that happened, or tell me what happened a little bit, or can I support you today, or how can I support you? You don't have to go into awkward rambles or weird things, but just give that person acknowledgement, because it's their experience. And
Yep.
something that I learned in the midst of my grief, and this was really hard for me to hear when I was in the middle of my grief. It made me really angry, but it was a very true statement. Um, that was my child's experience. Just like when my grandfather passed, that was his experience. It wasn't mine. I was taking on those experiences as if they were my own. And that's where all of our suffering and our emotions come flying out. It's because we're trying to take on that person's experience of life, but it really wasn't ours. And so, when we allow ourselves to just be the observer of that moment and participate in that moment to the best of our ability, we don't have to take it on, but we can hold space and just acknowledge it.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing those parts of your story. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
I just thought that was a beautiful example you gave of being in the gym, and one person saying,
Mhm.
"Oh, congratulations," and then somebody's son dies, and they go, "Yeah, I don't know about this. I don't know how to
Right.
talk about this. Like, this is strange."
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah, I just think it's amazing how it always takes one person. And I've kind of feel like,
Mm.
for whatever reason, when we do go through these moments in life, and I've never been able to understand this, but I do feel like God puts people on our path for some reason in those moments. And that's the person that speaks up, by the way. That's the one that says, well, I'm going to hold space while nobody else is doing it, so I can lead the others to show them how to do it.
Yeah. And I think well, for me, it's kind of, it was hard and scary and awkward at first to try to be the one to say and acknowledge. But what gave me courage to do that is, again, when I was given permission to tell a new story and thinking about what would I have wanted? What did I feel like I needed? And so then that kind of lets me go out on a skinny branch, so to speak, and just say, hey, how are you really doing today? Just asking the question and then just listening. And I don't need to fix it because the person isn't broken. I don't need to heal them because that's their journey if and when they're ready for it. But yeah, just being that one who can offer space for a different thought, question, wonder, part of healing. Yeah.
So how, I wanted to ask you early on in that grief process, were there times that you were able to process that grief a little bit back then? Like I know it was kind of hard to do so, but
Yeah.
I was curious about if you found moments through that journey that you were able to just sit with your emotions and process them. And like you said, how am I feeling today? And being honest with yourself is what I like to call it, not shadowing and hiding parts of it, but just saying, this is how I feel today, and that's okay.
Yeah. Um, Being in nature, being with my dog at the time, that helped bring some healing. I felt like the expanse of my emotions, I felt like my emotions were so big and deep that being outside felt like they could kind of hold it. When I was inside, I often felt like it was hard to breathe. I just felt so cramped and contained. So being outside and walking and fresh air and being with my dog, that helped a level of healing. But then also, I found a sense of normalcy in our little country church. For me,
Mm.
that was a place where I could sense community of all ages. And so many other places, even at school or the grocery store, other places in the community, when I would show up or my dad and I would show up, I felt like people did like what I explained that I did to that person at the gym sharing that her child died. You just look down or you look away or you try and pretend you're not seeing that person. I've shared this before when my dad and I would be at the grocery store, we'd go down the aisle and somebody would see us and they would like back out of the aisle and go down a different store. It just continued to heap on the guilt and the shame and the I'm now weird and I'm not welcome. But the church community was a place where I didn't get the oh or what do we talk to this child about? It was just normal. It was, hey, Jillene, how's school? How was your walk today or whatever. It was a place where I could be normal. And my pastor also really helped to kind of foster and lead that of we have joys, we have grief, we have day to day, and all of it is just messy, but it is what it is. And we don't have to put that on other people. We're just going to welcome people as they are, and we're going to help them find as best we can to support them to find what they need to find. And so the church and my pastor were really pivotal um, in creating space for me to slowly heal. And I think that that is a part of why I foster and why I foster such welcome and community and authentic. We don't have it all figured out. We have some people who have really great days, and we have people who have some really crappy days, and we all get to be together.
Well, I wanted to ask you, since you brought that up, you shared a very powerful story. Because I know we talked a little bit about being angry with God last time we
Mhm.
talked, and I wanted to, if you're willing to, I'd love for you to share this story on the podcast because I found it so moving and it empowered me when I heard it. Because we have moments where we're taught a lot, don't be angry with God, don't yell at God. I've heard that a lot growing up, and I've heard it from a lot of people, and I had my own personal moment after I lost my son where I yelled at God for probably 20, 30 minutes. I looked like a crazy person yelling at this cross at the end of my driveway. And I broke down crying and screaming at God, and I couldn't understand why this all had to happen. But I had a breakthrough in my journey at that point. But I wanted you to share your story about that and what this pastor offered you in that moment of being angry with God.
Yeah. So, Pastor Blair Lundborg is his name. And like I said, just a wonderful person. And he did ask questions, I think, as a way to support me in my healing journey. And I don't know how we got on the topic of anger, but I somehow shared with him that I was really, really mad at God, and I shared with him that I felt, a level of guilt with that, and he encouraged me to wonder about that and said, "Well, why can't you be mad at God?" And like you said, somehow I picked up along the way that you're not mad at God, God is God, and I remember Pastor Blair said, "Well, what would you say to God? And where is God? And how would you talk to God?" And so I said, God is in that box, which was the altar, still being young, not knowing what things are called. I said, God's in that altar in that room, the box in the room. It was the altar in the sanctuary. And Pastor Blair said, "Why don't you go tell God exactly what you're thinking and what you're feeling?" And I said, "I don't want anybody to come in." And he was so awesome because he said, I'll watch the door. You just go in there." And I remember going up to the altar and just screaming and crying and pounding my fists on the floor. And I don't know how long I was in there, but kind of then realized I was on the floor, just a sweaty, bawling mess. And I felt so good to be able to release that and tell God exactly how angry I was. And that was at about age 14 or 15. I don't remember where that had been along my healing journey, but I didn't drive yet. So I knew that I wasn't more than
Mm.
15. But then throughout, my life since then, it's always kind of been, what else is it like to be mad at God? And I've never had an experience quite like that, but I talk to God pretty vocally. I'm pretty natural. Um, I remember fast forward in my ministry, I had two people die on the same day. And I was so mad at God. And at that time, I ran. I was a runner, and there was a hill in the woods, and I remember just running up and down, yelling at God and probably swearing at God. "Why did these people die? This is horrible. You're you're leaving two families, and what are they gonna do?" And just talking, saying the things that I would to almost anybody else if I was upset, to just say, "Yeah, answer me. Give me peace." And I think in doing that, in being so real and vocal and honest, it opens ourselves up to give God a chance to speak back and offer that healing and offer that peace. Because if you say something to somebody, they might kind of shut down, but your stories are interwoven and they're going to carry that with them. But when we talk to our God, who I don't understand, I don't speak for God. I don't have the answers, but I do believe that God is loving and that God wants to meet us and offer us peace and healing and be real with, then when we can be honest with God, God can be honest with us.
That's very powerful what you just said, because in my own experiences, I don't always hear God talk back to me all the time, but I have had experiences where he talks through other people, and
Yeah.
I've never really been able to figure that out. But if you imagine yourself talking to somebody and your brain kind of checks out a little bit, and all of a sudden you're looking at this person very focused on their face, and when you stare at their mouth, you don't see the person in front of you, but you hear this other voice coming through. And that's what it's been like for me when I hear God sending me messages that we need to hear.
Very cool. Yeah.
Yeah, and I love that you shared that story because you were able to have that big emotional release after your mom
Hmm.
passed, and I love that that pastor gave you the space. I love that he said, "I'll watch the door for you. Go take
Yes.
care of your emotions. I'll hold space for you." And that's
Yep.
back to what you talked about acknowledgement of our grief. I love this that you shared that story for that reason because he not only held space for you, but he gave you the ability to process some of that emotion and get that emotion to move. and really get that energy out of you. Because that could have been, that must have been such a relief to some extent to get all that weight out of you for one. So this, so you can see it and acknowledge it and understand it a little better.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that in that experience, and then even the individual who accompanied me when I had my breakdown, they weren't telling me that this is what you think, this is what you feel, this is how you do it. They invited me to get to know my own story, and they encouraged me. You
Mm.
know, they noticed things that I shared and offered, and they encouraged me to follow that and use that if it helps. So that's in part why I became a grief, loss, and end of life coach, right? At, at the time of mom's death, when I was 14, I was encouraged to go to a therapist, and I'm grateful for the different talking modalities. And that helped to some extent, but I know that I also had all of these feelings. But fast forward then when I've come up against different bumps along my way, and I've talked with a therapist or a counselor or something like that, they want to go back to when I was 14. And I've said, you know, with all due respect, why is this coming up now? Accompany me now, and we might look back to some place. This could be something from when I was 40 or 30. It might not, I might not need to start back when I was 14, but where am I now? And where do I want to go? And that's what I love about coaching, right? You listen to a person tell their stories. You're a coach. You know this. You listen to where a person's at now, and you ask questions to help the person find the answer inside of them.
Yeah, that's
And
exactly what we do.
yes, and to encourage them to try new tools or practices or new ways of thinking that come from them. Yes, and so no disrespect to therapists or counselors or psychologists. They work really, really well for some people. Where I'm at right now, though, is I'm so curious about individuals. You know, what's your story now? Where do you want to get to? And what do you need to get there? Ah, so that's in part, like I said, why I like grief, loss, and end of life coaching is I don't have answers, but you do. So
Yeah.
let's get that. And um along with the grief coaching, I've also become certified as a grief yoga instructor.
Mm.
And so, if I may talk a little bit about that, grief yoga is similar but different to regular yoga. Yoga uses, you know, connecting with your thoughts and your breath and moving your body. Grief yoga uses that, but it also encourages you to use your sound, your own very natural primal sounds to support you in your journey. And so I imagine it like trying to move a heavy box. And grief can sometimes be like that, right? It's the thing that's in our way. But when we use our breath, we're like, okay, I got to bend over. I got to get this thing. I got to figure out how to do that. And then, and as you release
Mm.
that sound, it helps you move that thing and helps you move that grief. And that's what I find with people grieving. Sometimes they have these bigger emotions. And so when I practiced regular yoga, that was helpful to a point, but then also being invited to use bigger movement, bigger sounds, bigger breath has allowed me to move forward, really drudging up those big losses.
I love the way you describe that because, especially that breath work, like you just said, grief does feel like that. It feels like a 1,000 pound boulder sitting on your shoulders. And, you know,
Yes.
you're a lot of times people too subconsciously don't think about their breathing. A lot of people that do go through grief or living in it is very shallow breathing because
Mhm.
we're processing so quickly with such heavy emotion that we just forget a lot of times to breathe and just be present in the moment. That's very, very hard for people going through grief. So
Yes.
I can see how doing that with yoga would be very, very beneficial to get yourself mindful about your breathing in that capacity. And with the visualization, like you said, of moving that box and paying attention to your breathing, I can see how those two would connect with handling those bigger emotions.
Yeah. Yes. My fear that surrounded my mom's death, I has have been a shallow breather for years. And so then when I did practice yoga and deepened my breathing, that's when I was able to trace back in my body these big held emotions. But they had been compacted for so long over so many other niceties. And this is how you should do it. And this is how you should think. And this is how you should be, right? That once I started to be allowed to unravel some of those things, it's not always neat and tidy coming out.
No,
So
it's a
being able
messy.
to
I always
have
tell
people
people
go,
grief is
oh,
a messy, messy
oh,
process. It is not a linear path by any demeanor.
no, no, no. So to be able to have my breath to support me, the grounding of yoga, to just be like, okay, when I inhale, can I show this to you? Can
Yeah,
I invite you
absolutely.
to, yeah, I invite you to sit up a little bit taller and bring your belly button to your spine, so you're engaging your core muscles. Roll your shoulders up and just let them then roll down and stay back. You're creating space in your abdomen, in your chest. And when you inhale and hold it and exhale, 2 more times. Inhale and then exhale. 1 more time. Inhale and exhale. Can you tell me what you're thinking, what you're feeling?
I just felt very calm after that third one.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
felt some calm come over and just felt very centered. And my brain kind of slowed down for a minute. I wasn't thinking about all these thoughts I have usually when I'm recording a podcast. It like went right into, we're just here right now doing this exercise.
Yeah, we're here breathing. And that, like, physiologically, when we inhale, it causes our heart rate to increase because it's sending the blood and the oxygen out through our bodies. But then when you exhale, your body is like, oh, okay, I'm okay. Yeah, I'm not needing to worry about what's coming next, what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling. I'm not needing to respond. And it takes about 3 times to, like you said, that third breath, you just are like, oh, yeah, we're just here. And so to invite people to do that for 10, 20, 60 minutes, you can't worry about the to-do list or what you gotta, that meeting that didn't go well, you're right here. And when you're in grief, same thing. It's a pause from the shoulda, coulda, woulda, if only. It just allows you to be with yourself as you remember, as you talked about, letting other people have their experiences and you being able to have your experience of that loss. Yeah.
Yeah, I've always said with grief, I'm trying to find a good way to phrase that, but it really is your experience that you make it. And I think that when we go into grief a lot with people that aren't as open to and receptive to grief like past generations have been,
Mhm.
there's always these expectations and these people telling us what to do, how to think, how to feel, how to believe. Just do this, you'll be fine. Oh, time fixes everything, or just give it to God. It's not allowing yourself to have your experience you need to have. And kind of what you said earlier today, too, by the way, and I share this in my own coaching practice. You're not broken. You don't need to be
Right?
fixed. There's nothing wrong with you. Like that's the thing that I get looked at crazy sometimes when I say that to people, but it's the truth. You're not broken. You don't need to be fixed. I don't need to
Mhm.
tell you what to do, by the way. I don't. You have those answers within you. And something I came across in the last week too, that I thought was really powerful was this quote about grief. And it said, grief is a matter of the heart. It's not a matter of the mind. And so when we try
Mm.
to consciously solve a matter of the heart with the mind, it doesn't work, because the heart is not a conscious being. It's a part of your body that stores emotion and obviously pumps blood through our body, but it's not something that in our brain, in our mind, we can rationalize. We can say, "Oh, I had this experience. Okay, this is how I think I feel. Okay, well, I can do this. I can do that." The heart doesn't work that way. The heart holds and stores all of our experiences as we see them, not how other people see it, but as we see them individually. And so,
Ye-
to that point, when we're talking about grievers, or if you're around a griever, by the way, giving them space and allowing space for them to have their experience the way they need to have it. And if that means they need to cry for 20, 30 minutes to get all that emotion to process, that's what they need. They don't need to be told stop crying or, oh, it'll be fine. They don't need to hear those things because that's their experience they're having. So I just thought that was a powerful analogy that, our heart is not the conscious mind. It's a matter of the heart. And that heart takes more time to solve things than our conscious mind.
Mm. That's so true. I'm so glad you shared that. Yeah. Yeah. We like to make meaning, but our feelings don't make meaning. Our feelings are our feelings and our thoughts are our thoughts. And grief is experienced in both facets. Yeah. Hmm.
Well, another thing I've learned in grief I'd love to share with you, because I'm curious about your thoughts on this, is there's this ideology out there in certain ways that if we pray to God or ask God for something, that we have this idea that it's going to come to fruition in the way and shape we see it as, in our mind. And something I've come to find on my grief journey is that God works in a very mysterious way, and I know that's kind of cliche of things, but legitimately true. How you see things going on this route, it's going to be over here swirling around doing things to get to that same place. And I was wanted to ask you on your grief journey if that's what you've experienced.
Of God's moving in mysterious ways.
Yeah, like if you had,
Yeah.
I mean, like I never saw myself doing a podcast, let alone being a coach
Oh,
in the grief space. And all of a sudden I'm here because of losing my son and losing my grandfather. And I was like, well, geez, God, like I wanted to be a coach and I did not see myself in this space by any means. But
yes.
but you just end up there.
Yes. Right. Yeah. When my husband and I moved to southern Minnesota and I got connected with the community where the church I serve is, I asked the church leaders and the community leaders, what are the needs, what are the resources, and how can the church help pair those together? And so when I heard that there was a lack of resources around mental health, that was too much for me, right? Because my mom died because there weren't resources. And I'd been told, nope, don't talk about her, don't think about her. And so then it took me a while to continue to wonder, how could I share whatever, space, healing, opportunity, ways to think uh, around mental health. And so I kind of started that way, but then found it was, I kept going back to my own grief story. So I do think that we could benefit, many communities could benefit from more resources around mental health, but I think grief is a part of that too. Like when we grieve that we don't have what we need, whether a whole gamut of things there. But I now say I'm a pastor who specializes in grief. And never did I ever think I would do that, because I hardly ever talked about my mom.
Mm,
That means when I talk about grief, it means, let me tell you about my own grief story. Let me tell you about what it was like when I was 14 and my mom, Mina Jean, died by suicide. So to be able to invite people to see that I'm a safe person with their story, if they want to share it, I felt required me to be vulnerable and tell my own story. And I did not think that God, who I clearly told off you know, most part of you. So I say, take that anger, continue to work through it, and allow other people to express their anger, to ask their questions, to share their loved ones' names. Yeah, and I firmly believe this is what I'm supposed to be doing right now. And no way, 25 years ago, when I started in the ministry, did I think that was going to be the case.
Uh, from what it sounds like, I think that experience with your mom at 14 really sets you on the path to be where you are today. And I think it's such a beautiful gift. It's why I'm so glad I got to meet you, and I'm honored to have you on my podcast for this reason, is that you experienced one of the worst tragedies of life, one of the things that many of us don't ever wish to go through, but you experienced that. And today you are changing the world on how it sees and views grief, and you're holding space for people that might not have ever gotten it had they not crossed your path. And so I think it's such a beautiful gift in so many ways that your mom gave you. And that's what I love about what you're doing right now. I love the person that you are, by the way.
Thank you. Oh my gosh. Thank you. Very, very kind and gracious. And thank you for your work in inviting others to share their story, to be able to offer this connection and healing from two very different places.
Well, it's something I've learned on this podcast. I think I've talked to 47 or 48 people now on episodes, and the thing that I love is that I tell people this is my space for you to hold your own space and share your story exactly how it is, unfiltered, raw, because I want to bust the stigma that we don't talk about grief, or when we hear somebody in the gym say they lost their son and we look away because we're not sure how to deal with
Yes.
that. I want to break that thing and say, no, we can step up to that person. We can, it's that old age adage that we hear a lot in church, is that God, it put us here for a reason. And sometimes that reason is to be the person when somebody says, I'm going through something, to step up for them and help them and support them. And that's,
Mhm.
um, on the little bits I've read of the Bible, Jesus never turned his back on people. He never did. He always stepped up
Right.
and said, I'll help you and I'm here for you. And so,
Yeah.
I always think about, if we can change how the world sees grief with stories like yours today, if we can change that way we view grief, we can be more godlike, we can be more Christ-like in our world. And what a difference that would make, regardless of your religious backgrounds. I know you guys listening, if you are religious or not, that's fine. I have no preference with that. But I'll just say that
Right.
from the standpoint, if we see that there's somebody out there that needs help and I can go help them, and I can be okay in this moment, even though this might make me a little uncomfortable. I may not have dealt with this situation in particular, but I see a person that needs somebody to make them feel seen and heard and understood, and I can be that person for someone else. I think we can change the world with that paradigm.
I agree. I agree. And thank you for that vision, that encouragement. Yeah. And allowing people to hear that message.
Well, Jillian, as we wrap up the podcast today, I wanted to ask you a couple questions here. The first one is, when you run into somebody who is just going through grief or maybe feels stuck in grief, is there one or two things that you would share with them to help them navigate that journey just a little bit easier?
I think the biggest thing is to reassure an individual that they are not alone. Their journey is unique and individual, just like their loss, but they're not alone. I think that's the
That's
biggest thing.
That's very powerful, because grief is a very isolating journey at times. And
Mhm.
a lot of times we have people there for us initially when a loss happens or we go through something. But eventually those people go away and they move on with life, but we're not always ready to move on. And
Right.
so, to your point, being able to find people there that can help us not feel isolated and not feel alone, that's powerful advice. And I would encourage everybody listening today, too, by the way, there are people like Jilene in your community. You can go to any church out there and just ask somebody if they're knowledgeable with going through grief or knowledgeable with helping you through what you're going through at that time. I also know there's Facebook groups out there, there's other community resources where you live, and take advantage of that, because you may oftentimes be surprised that you'll find somebody who's experienced something similar to you, and they may be the best person to talk to.
Right. I have partnered with the local funeral home and we offer grief groups. And what I do is make sure that there's water, coffee, tea, invite people in, and I'll ask a couple questions, and their connections fostered with each other is life-changing. And then I say, okay, we're about done. We'll see you next week, right? But fostering that connection for people to remind them again that they're not alone. Hmm.
I love that. And Jillene, if people want to connect with you online, where can we find you?
Yeah, I'm on Facebook and Instagram with my name, Jillene Gallatin, but also Grounded Love for Grief and Loss. So I have a little website, www.groundedloveforgriefandloss, or else, like I said, on the socials, where I try to offer different encouragements of thoughts and philosophies around grief and loss. Some Bible verses, uh, some funny things that we sometimes experience with grief. So just trying to allow people to show up where they're at and hopefully be fed and encouraged.
I love that. And for our listeners today that aren't watching us on YouTube, I will have Jilline's links to her social and her website in the show notes so you guys can get in touch with her. I definitely recommend to reach out and follow her, by the way. She's one of the phenomenal people I've met through the podcasting community, and she just does beautiful work. So I just want to encourage you guys, if you're looking for somebody to connect with on your grief journey, get in touch with Jilliene. She's a great gal to connect with, and she's got a lot of powerful advice to share. So, Jilliene, I just want
Thank
to
you.
thank you so much for being a guest on today's podcast. And I do want to honor this podcast episode in honor of your mom because she set you on a journey that I know looked very messy and very painful up front, but she put you on a place to do some beautiful work in the world right now. And I just want to honor her memory for you as we close out the show.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for remembering my mom, Mina. And um, like I said, the great work that you're doing.
Well, thank you. Well, let's see here. And I want to thank our listeners for joining Jilliene and I on today's episode, The Empower Grief Journey. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with somebody you know who could benefit from Jillien's story. For more episodes that are designed to empower you and support you during your grief journey, please visit empowergriefjourney.com and subscribe to this podcast. You can also find us on Apple and Spotify. The Empowered Grief Journey is all about honoring your journey, embracing your emotions, and finding strength in your own time. You're never alone on this journey, and together we can navigate grief with courage and compassion. Until next time, be kind to yourself and take your grief journey one step at a time.